Hello, bonjour, je m'appelle Brad. Welcome to Overkill Global, Banger TV's international metal review show. This week, we're reviewing some awesome technical death metal from the Canadian province of Quebec, and we'll be talking to Metal Injection columnist Austin Weber. I'll give you some of my personal essential picks, and then stick around until the end because we're gonna get some extra albums in there that our Patreon donors, suggested. Speaking of which, feel free to head to our Patreon campaign and donate. Please subscribe if you haven't yet. Thanks. So, this episode's a bit different from the other ones because this is in our country, Canada. So we know a lot of stuff about Quebec. You might not though, so let me update you on this real quick. As far as land mass, Quebec is the biggest province in the whole country, and that their forests, just like the forested areas, are bigger than Sweden and Norway combined, so pretty metal. They also have the worst roads in Canada though. Like the roads really suck there. One time a bus crashed into the back of the band I was touring with and they wrote down our license plate. I'm like, dude, you rear-ended us. Anyway, oh yeah, there's one other thing very important from Quebec. They have a dish called poutine, it's poutine. The concept, French fries, cheese curds, gravy, all together. It's good. It's kind of messy. The metal from Quebec's not messy though. It's super technical and tight. So let's talk about that. So of course we wanted to represent our home country, and what better way to represent Canada than our world-renowned Quebec technical death metal scene. What do I know about this scene? Well, I think when I was younger, my first exposure was somebody from my parents' church introduced me to Cryptopsy, and I was intrigued, very interested in this insane noise that I was hearing. I saw Despise Lack on video on Much Loud, which is kind of like our Headbangers Ball. And I put two and two together and realized that they were both from the same place. So I started filling in the blanks. I found the more mellow death leaning Quo Vadis, the everything all at once technical deathcore of Beneath the Massacre, and the relatively straightforward technical death metal of Neuraxis. I also connected many of these bands through a Quebec indie label called Galley Records, and when I was younger, went to a tour called the Montreal Assault Tour when it rolled through Toronto. So because of all of that, I'm excited to delve into the Quebec technical death metal scene. Part of Overkill Global is talking about people who actually live in these places, and while this is pretty close to us, we're still gonna do that. So here we've got a video from journalist and honorary Montrealer Austin Weber, who writes Metal Injection's Tech Death Tuesday column.
Greetings, Banger TV. Austin Weber here, staff writer for Metal Injection's Tech Death Tuesday column. For the last several years, I've always felt strongly about tech death from the bands that do it best, and if we want to talk the ones that do it best, let's go to Quebec. In addition to the region's impressive death metal past, the scene is still really strong now thanks to modern acts like Unhuman, First Fragment, Hadalom, Pronostic, Acurion, Brought by Pain, and really could go on for a while, so let's get down to what I'm here for. Martyr, Warp Zone. Martyr were one of those ahead of their time bands, and as often happens in those cases, they've only become considered influential and legendary after their demise. It was the year 2000 when Martyr self-released their second album, Warp Zone, which was later reissued by Galley Records. The album is considered notable for its one-of-a-kind mix between prog thrash like Voivod, Oblivion, and Atheist, with complex death metal drawing from the best of all of the 90s scene. On top of that, you add in their strong groove dimension, jazz fusion elements, and inclusion of gnarly dissonance, and you get the infinitely dense masterpiece that is Martyr Warp Zone. The album still sounds just as fresh now as it did then, a whopping 18 years after release. And the unique sound they built on Warp Zone has gone on to have a huge influence on tech death and also on modern thrash by way of replication, whose founder David Davidson cites Martyr as a primary inspiration on his band's sound.
That's a great pick for Martyr. Let's go to my list, and we're gonna talk about 5 essential Quebec tech death albums ranked chronologically, not in order of best or anything, because that's just way too contentious. So first up, we have Cryptopsy and their album None So Vile, which came out in 1996 on Wrong Again Records, which later became Regain Records, and the album has since been reissued a whole bunch of times on a bunch of different labels. These guys formed in 1988 and went through a bunch of band members and name changes before they settled upon Cryptopsy in 1992. They've released 7 studio albums, and this is their second. This is undoubtedly the most brutal album on this list. Vocalist Lord Worm got his name from literally eating worms, and he sounds like the kind of fucked up monster who would actually keep those creatures as a part of his diet. In fact, the clip that opens this album is from The Exorcist 3, and it's got this guy making these like demonic possessed noises, and he goes, "I do that rather well, don't you think?" Kind of feels like a reference to Lord Worm, and he's just a monster of a vocalist, for lack of a better term. Drummer Flo Mounier became the metric by which a younger Brad would measure drummers. And despite the fact that it was so fast and wild throughout, the band really managed to maintain a sense of groove, in large part due to bassist Eric Langlois' funky slap bass. John Levasseur on guitar crafted riffs that were incisive and labyrinthine. You know, they snaked between creatively chaotic and just flat out brutal, with the solos splitting the difference with a slight tinge of melody on them. Add to that the piano beginning of Phobophile, the Army of Darkness clip that ends the album. What do you expect after all that? I'm giving this 5 crans sur 5 crans, which is the last time I'm gonna say it in French. That's 5 out of 5. You can see it on the bottom. Next up, we have Gorguts' album Obscura, released in 1998, originally on Olympic Recordings, and like Cryptopsy before them, then reissued on a whole slew of labels. Gorguts formed in 1989 by the only constant member, Luc Lemay, and they released 2 albums of much more straightforward death metal via Roadrunner Records, and then they put out one of the most defining tech death albums in the entire world. This is the most avant-garde and forward-thinking album on this list, and it was quite literally ahead of its time. The writing for it was completed in like 93, 94, but they sat on it for years with no record deal because no one wanted to put it out because death metal wasn't cool. But even if death metal was cool, this album was just on another level, and there was probably a lot of fans of death metal who didn't get it. Luc Lemay has said that they decided to play in a way that was anti-traditional metal playing. So that meant no fast picking, no power chords, etc., forcing them to essentially make up a new musical language. And they did, and evidently have succeeded. Throughout the album, Luc Lemay's counterpart on the guitar was also his counterpart on vocals. And Big Steve Hurtle's, tortured howl contrasted amazingly with Luc Lemay's death growl. This album literally created new subgenres of technical death metal, black metal. So I can't give it anything less than 5 out of 5 skulls. Splitting the difference between the classic era and the more recent era, we have Augury and their album Fragmentary Evidence, which came out in 2009 on Nuclear Blast Records. Augury formed in 2002 in Montreal. Since then, they've put out 3 albums, with their most recent one coming out just earlier this year. But if we're gonna talk about the classic essential albums, I gotta go back to their second one. I saw this band in 2010 in London, Ontario with Aborted and System Divide, and it was a $10 show, which is mind-boggling. I don't think anybody at the show was really prepared for these guys and their progressive technical death metal. The fact that they toured together on this album cycle makes sense though, because Aborted vocalist Sven actually created the album artwork for this and contributed guest vocals to the Augury song Ethereal, which opens up the album. Musically, these guys meld, death metal with the heights of progressive metal set by bands like Cynic and Atheist. And much like those bands, the bass playing is a huge plus on this album. It's played here by bassist Dominic Lapointe, who left the band but is back in for the new album. Overall, the music is progressive and inspiring and never gets dull because it's constantly shifting. I wanted to give this album 3 3/4 of a skull, but we don't get that technical. So I'm gonna round it up. This gets 4 skulls out of 5. All right, fast forwarding to the future. Well, not really, 2 years ago, the recent past. We've got Deviant Process, their album Paroxysm, which came out in 2016 on PRC Music. These Quebec City dudes have been a band for a decade, changing their name to Deviant Process after only the first year. But in the 9 that followed, they only released 1 EP and this, their first LP. This album is the most energetic on my list. It just doesn't stop. It's just constant riffs. And despite the fact that it's always going, it never really feels self-indulgent or showboaty like some tech death can. Yeah, it's riff-based, but not rip your face off based. It's a bold move for them to start out the album with just bass, but they do, and they pull it off well. They also go through the first 2 minutes of this album without a blast beat, which is kind of crazy for a tech death band, but they pull it off well, and these guys just simply don't play by the rules. They just play really well crafted tech death how they want to do it. So while this is probably the most straightforward tech death album on this list, they always keep things moving, interesting, energetic, and because of that, they manage to avoid many of the pitfalls of modern technical death metal. So for that reason, I'm also gonna give this one 4 out of 5 skulls. Last but not least, we have Sutra's Dunes. It was released last year, independently. Find it on Bandcamp. They formed in 2011 in Montreal, and this is their first album. This album and band in general have the most potential for further progression on this list. I mean, really only these guys in Deviant Process are up for that because the other 3 have shown their progression after those albums. And while Deviant Process will no doubt continue to improve, these guys have the potential to evolve into something truly unique. The tech death elements on Dunes are a happy medium between dissonance and melody. Think somewhere between Gorguts and latter era death with some more modern bands sprinkled throughout. Sutra's greatest strength is their ability to space stuff out, so it never feels repetitious. They take their brutal gurgling vocals and just use them throughout. And there are also brief reprieves from the sonic onslaught. I've read in interviews that vocalist Laurent Bellemare went on a sabbatical to Indonesia to study their culture and their music. but they're just not super obvious. This concept that they used in the song that I played earlier, they use interlocking melodies, or kotekan. For most people, that probably just sounds like complex, intricate songwriting. I would love more of the overt instrumentation. That being said, when they do use it here, it's really interesting, and I'm excited to hear what they do in the future. So for that reason, I'm gonna give this album 4.5 skulls out of 5. What have we learned about Quebec technical death metal? There is a lot of crossover between these bands. The musicians are of such high caliber that a new bassist comes along, he can't just pick up 3 other people to start a band with. He's like, who plays on my level? So that's why, Augury's bass player went on to play with Beyond Creation, whose drummer plays in Chthilist, whose guitarist plays in Sutra, whose bassist also plays in Chthilist Live, plus the vocalist guitarist of Augury does guest vocals on the Sutra album, and then Big Steve left Gorguts. He formed Negativa with Augury's drummer. He was replaced in Gorguts by Dan Mongrain of Martyr, who since joined Voivod. It all comes full circle because Voivod is quite possibly the reason why Quebec is known for technical, skronky, bizarre, forward-thinking death metal. Long story short, Voivod influenced Quebec tech death. Now Quebec tech death is in Voivod, influencing Voivod, and the whole province is just in a weird vortex of weird. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, we're gonna do some honorable mention from our Patreon donors. We have Quo Vadis and their album Day Into Night, which came out in 2000 on Hypnotic Records, Beyond Creation and their album The Aura, which came out in 2011 on PRC Music, and again, deservedly, Gorguts and their album Colored Sands, which came out in 2013 on Season of Mist. Thank you for watching and participating, subscribing, Patreon donoring, that's not a word, whatever. If you want to talk more, tell us what we missed, leave comments, let's talk. As for me, well, I'm gonna go listen to the dumbest, most stupid caveman GED riff ass, chicken nugget barbecue ass death metal that I can. I need a break from this dread.
Fight those who enslave. Unification or death. Take gun to our